The sun sets over the jagged cliffs of the American Southwest, and the desert exhales a slow, burning wind. You can almost feel it, the silence before chaos, the stillness that always came before the sound of hooves, the shriek of war cries, and the fire that would consume everything. For the settlers who built their fragile homes along the edge of Apache territory, nightfall was never a time of rest. It was a time of listening to every rustle, every echo, every whisper that could mean death was near. They lived not by the peace of the stars, but by the dread that any night could be their last. Because when the Apache came, they came like ghosts, unseen until it was too late. Imagine this, a family asleep inside a small log cabin, miles from the nearest fort. A mother stirring from her dreams to the faint sound of dogs barking in the distance. Then, a sudden scream. The door bursts open, and figures rush in, painted faces, the gleam of blades catching firelight. There is no time to think, no time to pray. The mother grabs her child, but Hans sees her hair, dragging her into the dirt outside. The air fills with smoke, with terror, with the smell of burning wood and blood. This was not war as men understood it. It was something older, primal, something born from a world where mercy meant weakness. For the Apache, raids were not senseless acts of savagery. They were strategy, a brutal necessity in a land that offered little forgiveness. Survival in the desert meant taking what you could, when you could. Food, weapons, horses, and people. Capturing women during raids was as much a part of their warfare as the arrow or the spear. The women taken were both spoils and symbols, tokens of victory, leverage in negotiation, or servants in the relentless struggle to endure the wilderness. But for the captives themselves, each mile they were forced to walk deeper into Apache territory was a step away from life as they knew it, a slow descent into a living nightmare. Some were dragged across miles of rocky ground, tied behind horses until their feet bled and their voices broke. They were given little food, less water, and no comfort. The screams of the wounded faded into the desert winds, swallowed by an indifferent sky. A Spanish friar, Alonso de Benavides, once wrote of such captives, "Their suffering is beyond words. They walk bound, burned by the sun, starved by the journey, and beaten for falling behind." His words barely scratched the surface. Those who survived the march often wished they hadn't, because captivity among the Apache was not merely a loss of freedom, it was a transformation of identity, of humanity itself. In the villages, captives faced their new fate. Some were forced into servitude, gathering firewood, fetching water, grinding maize until their hands split and bled. Others were used as barter, traded among tribes or sold to passing merchants. Yet the most haunting fate was reserved for those who became wives. The Apache concept of marriage could be both practical and cruel. A woman captured in battle could be taken as a wife by her captor, not out of affection, but dominance. She would bear his children, serve his family, and be expected to accept her new life without resistance. Her name, her language, her faith, all erased. There are stories of women who tried to run, only to be hunted down and dragged back to camp, beaten as an example. Some were killed for defiance. The line between life and death was as thin as the desert wind. For the Apache warrior, taking a woman as a wife after a raid was not merely an act of possession, it was a statement of power. In a world governed by conflict, control was survival, and domination was victory. The women were symbols of both conquest and continuity, the human currency of a society that lived on the edge of extinction. The settlers told stories too, dark, trembling tales of what happened to women taken by Apache bands. Others who vanished into the desert and were never seen again. Daughters found years later, their eyes empty, their tongues speaking a language not their own. In some rare cases, women assimilated fully into Apache life. They learned the language, bore children, and became part of the tribe. But even then a shadow lingered. The memory of another world, another name, another self. Some were torn between two existences, one forced upon them and one they could no longer return to. But not all Apache were monsters. Not all acts were born of cruelty. In truth, their violence mirrored that of the settlers and soldiers who hunted them, burned their villages and killed their families. This was not a story of good versus evil. It was a cycle of vengeance, each side convinced it was avenging the other's sins. The brutality of Apache raids must be seen in that mirror, a world where mercy was drowned by survival, and humanity was reduced to a contest of endurance. The women caught between these two worlds bore the weight of both sides' rage. Still, some acts defied even that grim logic. There were accounts of captives burned alive, a punishment for betrayal or resistance, others mutilated as a warning to intruders, fingers cut off, faces branded with hot stones, bodies left in the open as silent messages to the soldiers who dared to pursue. The violence was not random. It was ritualistic, a language of fear understood by all who saw it. Each mark told a story of trespass, revenge, and the high cost of defiance. For the Apache, such displays served to protect their land. For the settlers, they were horrors beyond comprehension. Both sides saw the other as savages, incapable of mercy. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in the ashes. The captives who endured these ordeals were living witnesses to the breakdown of humanity, the point where suffering became currency and fear became law. Imagine one such woman, taken from a ranch near the Rio Grande. Her name was Anna. She was 19, newly married, her life barely beginning when the raid came. She watched her husband die trying to defend their home. She was tied and dragged through the dust for 2 days, her mouth dry, her body covered in cuts. When she collapsed, they lifted her by the hair, whispering words she didn't understand. In the camp, she was given to a warrior, a man whose face was painted with ashen blood. He called her Woman. That was all. No name, no identity. Just a title that meant belonging, but not to herself. Weeks passed. She learned to obey, to move silently, to work without being seen. At night, she would look at the stars and wonder if her family was searching for her, or if they had already buried her memory. The desert had a way of consuming everything, not just bodies, but names, prayers, and hope. Her story, like countless others, was never recorded. She vanished into the land, another ghost in the endless cycle of vengeance. And yet, beneath all this darkness, there was something disturbingly human: fear, pride, desperation. The Apache were fighting for survival in a world closing in around them, a world of rifles, railroads, and encroaching settlers. Their violence was both rebellion and resistance, their cruelty both weapon and warning. And the women caught between these forces, settlers, Mexicans, rival tribes, became the tragic victims of that desperate struggle. Their pain, though unspeakable, tells us more about the nature of survival than any battle ever could. As the flames of one burning cabin fade into the night sky, the question lingers: what does it mean to survive when survival itself demands the loss of your soul? For the captive women of the Apache Wars, that question was not philosophical. It was their reality. Every breath a fight, every dawn another trial. Their lives were written in silence and shadow, in the untold corners of history where suffering becomes invisible. And when the wind howls across the desert today, you can almost hear them. Voices carried through time, whispering of the fear, the pain, and the will to endure in a world that offered none. Morning comes slowly in the desert. The light creeps over the red cliffs and broken stones, revealing the wreckage left behind. Burned wagons, scattered bones, a doll missing its head lying in the sand. The silence after a raid was worse than the screams that came before it. It was the sound of what remained, a world emptied of meaning. For those taken, this silence marked the beginning of a different kind of suffering, captivity that blurred days into nights, erasing everything they once were. The Apache camp was a world apart. Smoke curled from low fires, horses stamped the dust, and the air smelled of sweat and smoke. The captives lived on the edge of this existence, neither dead nor truly alive. They were outsiders, tolerated, used, but never trusted. The women fetched water, gathered cactus fruit, and tended to the warriors' wounds after battle. They were watched constantly, reminded that escape meant death. Yet even among their captors they sometimes glimpsed something strange. Not pity, not affection, but a shared sense of being trapped by the world they'd been born into. Some warriors treated their captives harshly, breaking them through fear. Others, especially older ones, treated them with a detached practicality, tools in the machinery of survival. But among the young and proud, brutality was often a performance. To show weakness was to invite challenge. A man's worth was measured in how much he could take, and how much he could inflict. Beating a captive was not just punishment, it was a ritual, a reminder that dominance was life itself. Every blow was a lesson carved into flesh, a declaration that the world belonged to the strong. And yet, there were moments that defied the logic of cruelty. Some women, after months or years, were allowed small freedoms. They learned the language, sat by the fires, listened to the songs of a people both fierce and wounded. Some bore children, sons and daughters who lived between two worlds, never fully belonging to either. These children were living contradictions, born from violence yet symbols of survival. They carried in their blood both conqueror and captive, hunter and hunted. There are records, fragments of journals, missionary reports and government documents, that tell of women who returned years after their capture. Some were found by soldiers or traders, speaking Apache more fluently than English, dressed in deerskin and beads, their eyes distant. They were ghosts of two identities. Some refused to return to their former lives, saying the world they came from no longer existed. Others tried to rejoin their families, only to find they no longer fit. Society saw them as tainted, marked by the shame of what had been done to them. They carried the scars of both their captivity and the cruelty of their own people's rejection. One woman, taken from a ranch near Tucson, was found 10 years later by a cavalry patrol. She had been living as the wife of an Apache chief, mother to 3 children. When the soldiers tried to rescue her, she resisted. She spoke little English, wept when they separated her from her family, and ultimately refused to return to the settlement. In the official report, the officer wrote, "She has gone native, beyond redemption." But what the report could not understand was that she had built a life out of ashes, one that, though born from violence, had become her only truth. The world of the frontier had no space for such complexity. It wanted heroes and villains, savages and victims. But the reality was far darker and far more human. Both sides knew loss, and both committed atrocities. The US military's campaigns against the Apache were often as merciless as the raids they sought to avenge. Villages were burned, prisoners executed, and families slaughtered in retribution. For every story of a woman taken by the Apache, there was another of an Apache woman killed by soldiers or settlers. The land itself became a graveyard of vengeance. Among the Apache, pain was not something to hide. It was a teacher. It shaped their culture, hardened their resolve. Their cruelty was not random but deliberate, a warning to the world that they would not be broken. For captives, that lesson was written in blood. Many women were branded or mutilated, not merely to punish them, but to mark them as property. Fingers severed to prevent escape, faces burned to erase identity, hair shorn as a symbol of shame. These acts were not only physical domination but psychological warfare. They stripped away humanity piece by piece, until the captive no longer recognized herself. And yet, some endured. Some fought back in quiet ways, by surviving, by refusing to die, by remembering who they were. There are stories of women who escaped after months of captivity, walking barefoot for days through the desert, following rivers or stars to find safety. Some were rescued half dead, their bodies scarred, their minds fractured. But even then, they carried their trauma like invisible fire, burning silently for the rest of their lives. One such story comes from 1851. A girl named Olive Oatman. She was captured with her sister after her family was massacred. Sold and traded between tribes, tattooed on her chin by the Mojave, she became a living relic of captivity. When she was finally ransomed years later, the world saw her as a curiosity, her tattooed face a mark of savagery, her silence a mystery. But in truth, Olive's story was not unique. It was the story of hundreds of women whose bodies and minds bore the geography of pain. They were human maps of a war that had no front lines and no mercy. To the Apache, the violence they inflicted was a language, one understood across generations. To settlers and soldiers, it was barbarism. Yet both sides used the same tools: fear, revenge, and blood. The difference was only in the story each side told. The captives, however, belonged to neither narrative. They were the forgotten middle, not heroes, not villains, but survivors of both. The desert kept their secrets well. It buried bones, erased footprints, and carried screams into silence. Over time, legends replaced truth. Campfire tales of Apache, cruelty grew into myths, exaggerated by fear and hate. The reality was already horrific enough, but history, hungry for spectacle, made it worse. Still, beneath those legends lie the voices of real women, their suffering, their strength, and the echoes of everything they lost. And as history marched on, the Apache themselves became the hunted. The same warriors who once brought terror to the frontier were driven into exile, starved, imprisoned, or killed. The empire of fear they built collapsed under the weight of another empire, one with iron rails, rifles, and flags. When the last Apache strongholds fell, the world changed. But for the women who had lived and died in the shadow of that war, there was no victory, only silence. Today, the ruins of old forts and settlements still stand, half buried in sand. The wind moves through them like a memory, whispering stories the world prefers to forget. The story of captivity and survival, of cruelty and endurance, of women whose names are lost but whose pain shaped the landscape itself. Every scar, every grave, every fragment of bone unearthed by time tells us that the frontier was not built by heroes alone. It was built by those who suffered, those who endured, and those who were never meant to be remembered. So when you hear the tales of the Wild West, of brave cowboys, noble soldiers, and fierce Apache warriors, remember the women whose stories were never told, the ones who walked barefoot through the desert night, who carried their dead in silence, who bore the children of their captors and still found a way to live. Their tragedy is the truth beneath the legend, because history is not written by the survivors, it's written by those who are allowed to speak. The women who lived and died in Apache captivity were denied both, but their silence speaks louder than any myth. It reminds us that in every story of conquest and victory there are ghosts, unseen, unheard, but always watching. And perhaps somewhere in the dry wind that sweeps through the canyons at dusk, you can still hear them, the faint echo of their sorrow, whispering across time, a lament for everything humanity lost in its endless hunger to conquer and survive.